right. Well, hey, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robbie. I'm the senior minister here at Gateway, and I'm excited to jump into what we're talking today. You know what? I shouldn't have said that. I'm really not excited to jump into this one because here's the thing: is I know for a lot of people in this room, you're going to hate this message, and to be honest, I hate this message sometimes. Like this is something that when I hear this from Scripture, depending on what's going on in my life at the time, sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, that's so good. And other times I'm like, not today. Like we didn't need to go there today. Of all days, of all the things going on. So I realize ahead of time that that's where some of you may be today when we tackle this. But it's something that I think God has really prepared for us today as a congregation, for me, for you, for all of us. And it's something, to be honest, it's a message that's fairly familiar to us, especially if you're a Jesus follower, if you've been following Jesus for really any length of time. There's not a lot that I'm going to say today that it's going to like blow you away. It's just something that we don't always like to talk about. See, today we're kind of in the second week of a new series. We kicked off a new series last week, and it's actually, we say new series, we're actually picking up on a journey that we've been going throughout the year, that we've been working our way through the Gospel of Luke, and we'll do it for a few weeks, and then we'll stop and talk about something else, and then kind of come back to it a little bit later. And so we've been going through the Gospel of Luke. It's one of the 4 historical accounts of Jesus' life that's found in the Bible. And as we come to this part of Luke, we're calling this series Come to Jesus Moments, because every single week we're going to be taking a look at a different time where somebody, or maybe a group of people, came to Jesus for something, that they physically came to talk with him, to listen to him, because they wanted something for him. Oftentimes the people that come to Jesus in these moments that we're going to be looking at are there for a specific thing. Sometimes they want healing. Sometimes they get what they want. Sometimes they don't get quite what they wanted from Jesus. Well, almost always they end up receiving more than they expected from Jesus. Sometimes they get something completely different from what they expected to get from Jesus. Last weekend, Leland kicked off this series by talking about a story about some friends who brought their paralyzed friend to Jesus, and they brought him looking for healing, and he received that. He received healing, but also received forgiveness, and that encounter led him to being a follower of Jesus. And if you remember last week, if you were here or if you watched online, Leland talked about how Jesus wants us to be followers and not just fans of his. He wants us to really pay attention to what it means to follow him. And then Leland gave us some characteristics last week of followers of Jesus. And one of those was that followers of Jesus follow his word. Basically, that they obey him. And so the question as we get started this morning is, are you up for that? Are you up for obeying Jesus' word? And that may sound like an easy question, like, yeah, and well, we'll see. We're in Luke chapter 6 today. If you got a Bible, open it up, turn it on, do whatever you need to do to get there. Luke chapter 6. In this passage, to kind of set the scene of what's been going on, there's a large crowd of people, and they've come to hear Jesus teach. And it says that some of the people in the crowd have also come to be healed. And so in Luke chapter 6, we have this large chunk of teaching from Jesus, where he's teaching some of his most famous things that he's known to have said. This section of Luke chapter 6, is known as what's called the Sermon on the Plain. You might be familiar with another famous sermon of Jesus called the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Plain was given at a different time, but a lot of the material in the Sermon on the Plain, as a matter of fact, almost all of it, are things that Jesus also said in his more famous Sermon on the Mount. You find that one in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Now, the Sermon on the Plain, though, it's a little bit different. It's a lot shorter than the Sermon on the Mount. And some of the things that Jesus says in it are in just a little bit slightly different order. But they both contain this statement that we're going to start out this morning. And this statement, this thing that Jesus said, is one of the most profound, if not the single most profound things that have ever been said in the history of the world. This is what Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. He says, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies." When he says to you who are listening, that's like a shorthand way of saying, okay, you came to listen to me. He's already been doing a little bit of teaching. As you've heard all this, okay, now for those of you who are really in, like if you're really up for following me, then here's something for you. It says, if you're really going to follow me, then you'll love your enemies. See, most of the great faith systems, most of the great religions of the world, we actually end up having a lot of overlapping kind of ethical teachings. Like pretty much all over the world, in every faith, you're going to find things like don't steal and don't kill, and it's not good to covet what other people have, and it's not good to be materialistic, always focused on what you can get for yourself. Most of them are going to teach something along the lines of don't seek revenge. When somebody does wrong to you, you shouldn't return wrong to them. But there is absolutely nothing that compares to what Jesus has said here. That Jesus, by those simple three words, love your enemies, he puts forth the most radical ethic of love in the history of the world. Before Jesus, nothing like this existed on the planet. Nobody had ever tried to convince people to do something like this. And the only people who have said anything on its level since then have been followers of Jesus. See, Jesus puts forth this incredibly radical ethic of love. And as we hear it, on the one hand, we hear this and you just know that it's different and you know that it's special. It feels a little bit sublime. It feels like this awe-inspiring idea, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. This is an incredibly beautiful thing to say. On the other hand, we all know it is really hard. It is really hard to do. It is so hard to be kind to someone who has been unkind to you. And it is hard to be sensitive to someone who has been insensitive to you. It's hard not to lash out at people and to hurt people who have hurt us. And so this may be, in my opinion it is, this may be the most difficult thing that Jesus asks you to do, is to love your enemies, which is why almost nobody follows this advice. Like, even though we would all agree that, yeah, that's a good thing, almost none of us actually try to do this when we have opportunities to do it. And I'm lumping everybody together with that. Christian, non-Christian, doesn't matter. This is like the one command of Jesus that we all agree, we can agree that it's a good thing to do, but practically in life we feel like we can just kind of ignore it. And that word ignore it's pretty strong, I know. It makes us maybe feel a little uncomfortable. But the reality is that even though we all know that loving our enemies shows the pinnacle of love, we know that the world would be better if more people did this. Even though we know all this, even though we know that this is how we wish people would treat us when we do wrong to them, that we wish people would just maybe slow down and try to understand us a little more, or maybe just be a little bit more patient with me, or don't hold that against me, or please don't tell everyone else what I did to you when I was at my worst, even though we wish people would treat us that way, it's something that we tend to not extend to others. We know that it's the better way to live, which means that we also know that if we aren't doing it as followers of Jesus, there's got to be a really good reason for it. And so we put a ton of energy into explaining in whatever situation we're in life why we are exempt from it. Why the situation that I'm facing, the difficulty that I'm facing, the enemy that I'm going against, that there's a reason why I don't have to do this. And it usually goes something like this. They started it. Or maybe sometimes I've heard people say, Jesus says to love my enemies, but I don't have to like them. Or I can love my enemies. I'm just going to tough love my enemies. You know what tough love is, right? Like the oh so wise Michael Scott from The Office, the greatest TV show of all time. He says that tough love is when you have to be mean to somebody because you love them. And the more you love a person, the meaner you have to get. See, the natural reaction for all of us when somebody hurts us is to respond in kind, because all pain in life, regardless of how big or small it is, all pain is absolutely consuming while we're experiencing it. It's the only thing that we can give our attention to. And so we feel like we need to respond in kind. That when somebody hurts us, it's a natural inclination to get even. But the problem with getting even is that even if you aren't a follower of Jesus, the problem with getting even is who it makes you. See, the problem with getting even is that it makes us even with somebody that we don't even like. Right? Like you're upset with the person who did the thing to you, and when you get even with them, you actually become just like them. And that's what we do. We become just like the people that have hurt us. And it makes us like someone that we dislike. So what do? The reality is that enemies are real. We can't just pretend that there aren't enemies in life. We can't pretend that they're not there. We can't ignore them, because if we ignore our enemies, then sometimes it just empowers them. And eventually, they're going to continue doing this thing until eventually you're going to break and you're going to react badly. And so for all of us, you've experienced this before, for all of us, some of our greatest regrets are how we responded to someone or how we reacted to our enemies. And so we can't ignore them. We don't want to become like them either. And so we need a third option. And that's exactly what Jesus gives us here. We can love them. And he gets more specific than that. He gives us 3 specific ways we can love our enemies. He goes on, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. He gives us 3 really specific things that we can do to our enemies there, that we should do to our enemies there. First off, he tells us to do good to those who hate you. Not just ignore those who hate you. Not just don't be unkind to the people who hate you. Do good to them. To which we say, I thought I was doing good by just not hurting them. Like I didn't hurt him or her. I didn't let the air out of their tires. I didn't put all their clothes out on the street. I didn't even make a passive-aggressive social media post. Like I didn't do any of those things. I thought I was already being good because of what I hadn't done. But Jesus says we're to actively do good to them. And to be honest, that idea of doing good to somebody is pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. We're called to do good to people, even to our enemies. But then he goes on, and Jesus then says, not only are we supposed to do good to those who hate us, but then we're supposed to, it says, to bless those who curse you. See, when you bless someone, it's about how you talk to them and about them. What Jesus is saying here is your words matter. That even the way you talk to or about the people who have caused the most pain in your life, it's super, super important. Your words matter. And we try to get out of this one. Maybe you're like me, and you were taught that if you can't say anything nice, then don't say anything at all, right? Like you've probably heard that at some point in life. And you know who taught you that? Not Jesus. See, there is always a way for us to speak highly of somebody. There's always a good thing that we can say about them, even if it's simply to say that that person is precious because they were created in the image of God. There is always something that we can say in the good about them. See, what you have to make sure not to do, though, is to speak highly of them maybe in public, while privately or internally bashing them. See, when you do that, when you pretend that everything's good, but then internally or in private, maybe in a more intimate conversation or relationship with somebody, you're bashing that enemy. When you do this, when you curse those who curse you, when you have that eye for an eye attitude, what's happening there is the enemy is actually planting seeds. He's planting seeds in your heart and in your life, and he is watering them so that they continue to grow and to eventually produce a future fruit of division. There's no real healing going on. It's just delayed division. Jesus is saying, look, those seeds that the enemy plants, this is how you uproot those. This is how you get rid of them. You do good. You bless the other person, and you pray for those who mistreat you. Let's be honest. Does anybody do this? Like, if we're honest, I think most of us in the room would be able to say, look, I don't even spend very much time praying for the people who treat me well. I don't know that I'm really going to pray for the people who are mistreating me. And yet Jesus says to pray for those who mistreat you. Now, this is so hard. I'll be honest. My prayer life, you want to know what my prayer life sounds sometimes when I've got an enemy that I'm having an issue with? Sometimes it sounds like this. God, I cannot stand this person, but I don't want to be able to not stand somebody that you love. I don't love them right now. I don't like them right now. I don't want to be around them right now, and I need your help. And that's just me being honest. Sometimes that prayer is like 5 seconds long because that's all I can do. Sometimes it's like, look, there, I did it. I prayed for them. But when we can do even that and take that small step of praying for someone, over time, as we do good and as we bless them and as we pray for them, the Holy Spirit begins to work and we begin to have compassion on them. Because we begin to see them the way that God sees them. And we begin to understand maybe some of the reasons that they are the way they are, or that they do things the way that they do. And I know this all seems really simplistic. Like, really, we're just supposed to do good and say nice things about people and to pray for them. I know. Like, we all want to stand up and we want to scream our whatabouts. Or what about this? And what about what they did? And what about? I know. But what if the only complicated thing about loving our enemies is that it's actually not complicated? It's not hard for us to know what to do. That's why Jesus blows through those examples so quickly. Yeah, do good, bless them, pray for them. It's not hard to know what to do to love our enemies. It's just hard to actually do it. So for the rest of our time together, as we work through this teaching of Jesus, I want to highlight 3 realities about loving your enemies that can actually help us do it. These are things that are important to know going in. Like, on the front end of trying to love your enemies, if you can understand these 3 things, it will make it so much easier for you to take those steps. It'll make it so much easier for you to seek to love your neighbor by doing good and blessing and praying for them. But you're the one who decides how you take these, because I recognize this as well. As I go through these, you could view these as things that make it easier for you to love them, or you could also very easily view these as reasons why you can't love your enemies. Like, this is yes, I know you might hear these reasons, these realities, and say, you know what? That's actually the reason why I can't do this. So I get it. But I want to argue with you is that I would argue that understanding these up front is actually the only way that you'll be able to do it. This is understanding these 3 things that we're about to talk about is the only way that you'll be able to love your enemies, to do this thing that we all agree when Jesus said it was mind-blowing and good. So here's the first one. Look, you will not be able to love your enemies as Jesus calls you to if you cannot accept these 3 things, and here's the first one. The truth is that loving your enemies requires you to do before you feel. It requires you to do before you feel. See, we tend to think of love as a feeling. We only have one word for love in the English language, and we use it so incredibly broadly. We love everything from our spouse and our kids to pizza and blue skies, and you fill in the blank with all kinds of different, like even little menial things that we would even agree aren't really all that important, but yet we describe our feelings toward them, these great things and these things. We describe it the same way because we just have the one word. But in Greek, in the Greek language in which Luke is writing down the words of Jesus, there's 4 different words for love. There's one word that's used to describe romantic love. There's another one that describes kind of a family love. And there's another one that describes a brotherly love. And all 3 of those describe the feeling kind of love that we typically think of in our culture. But the word for love that Jesus uses here, it's not a feeling word. He uses the word agapao, which is the Greek word that means it's a different kind of love. It's not a feeling kind of love. This is kind of the definition that I give it. That agapao, the kind of love that Jesus is calling us to have, he calls us to have it for each other, but also specifically here towards our enemies. It's a continuous commitment to the betterment of another person. That's how we're to love our enemies, with a continuous commitment to their betterment. It's not about how we feel about them. That if you love your enemies, if you wait to love your enemies until your feelings toward them change, you will never love your enemies. You just won't. That feeling doesn't come first. And so Jesus doesn't tell us how we should feel. He tells us what we should do. That we should be committed to their good. And then he gives some examples. He goes on in verse 29. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. And we hear those and we object to them because they all feel like we're doing nothing, right? Like we read those and we hear those and we go, yeah, I know Jesus said it and so it must be good. But when you really examine these, you go, that just sounds so weak. Like it just sounds like you're doing nothing. That you're just letting this other person who has hurt you just walk all over you again and again and again. But that's not what Jesus is commanding here. See, this idea of turning the other cheek, it's actually the total opposite of how our hearts typically work. See, when someone harms us in life, we typically want to respond in one of 2 ways. The first one is a passive response. It's the do nothing. It's I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to rock the boat. And I'm just going to let them hit the same cheek over and over and over again. Some of us respond to injustice by doing nothing. We don't complain. We don't speak up. We just let it continue. Some of us find it more painful to change the status quo than to confront. And so we'll just take it. The other response is the vindictive response. That's the one that says, hit them back. They hit you, you hit them back, and you seek to get even. Some of us do both. We are both passive and vindictive. We do both. We let it go on and on and on until we can't take it anymore, and then we explode. That's me. Jesus says, look, neither of those responses or any combination of them, none of them are good. Jesus doesn't tell us to just leave that same cheek there and let him continue to strike it over and over and over, and Jesus doesn't tell us to hit him back. He says to turn the other cheek. What he's saying is, put the relationship on new footing and start over. See, turn the other cheek doesn't withdraw, and turning the other cheek doesn't continue taking abuse. What it does, turning the other cheek, sets new parameters for the relationship and provides an opportunity to try again. It can be as simple as this. I heard somebody in a phone conversation one time. You ever been in a room where someone's having like a serious phone conversation and you're trying not to listen? but you just can't help it. Like it's kind of interesting. Plus, like maybe they're really close by, maybe they're being loud. For whatever reason, you're paying attention to this conversation. And so I was doing this one time. I think it might have been an airport or something like that. But I hear this lady. She's on their phone, apparently with her father, and it's getting kind of heated. And I hear her say to him, "Dad, I love you, but if you continue to talk to me this way, I'm going to hang up and we'll try again tomorrow." And I just felt like that was such a beautiful picture of what it means to turn the other cheek. She didn't abandon the relationship. She sets it on a new footing, says that we need to course correct. We need to change some things and give it another go. It can be as simple as that. If you keep talking to me this way, I'm going to end the conversation. We can try again another day. The idea is don't continue as it is, but make a change and offer an opportunity for them to kiss your cheek instead of striking it. To be honest, it's going to cost you. The potential is there for more pain. And that's the reason most of us don't like this idea. Because we know that that potential is there. But I would argue that it's also a protection. That there's a built-in protection there over time, that if the abuse continues, you continue to enforce stricter boundaries. But see, you're not going to want to do it at first. The temptation is going to be to either do nothing, don't say anything, don't rock the boat, or just cut them out of your life completely. Because if you wait until you feel it, you'll never get there. If you wait to do good, if you wait to bless them, if you wait to pray for them until you feel like they deserve it, or until you feel ready to do it, you'll never get there. Loving enemies requires you to do before you feel. And that's why Jesus says this thing next in verse 31. You're familiar with this. Do to others as you would have them do to you. That's the golden rule, right? Like, the golden rule that we've all, even if you're not a Christian, you've heard this over and over throughout your life, is that we're supposed to do for others what we wish that they would do for us. Just like we're all familiar with it, everyone in Jesus' day was also familiar with it, but in a slightly different way. We'll call it the silver rule. That in Judaism and in most major religions around the world, you'll find the negative form of this command. Basically, you'll find a command that says, don't do what you wouldn't want someone to do for you. But Jesus ups the commitment level. He says, look, it's not about just not causing harm. It's not about just not doing the bad things. But it's about doing good. He ups the commitment. Why? Because everybody already believes the other thing. But also, that other way of doing things, that commitment to, well, I'm just not going to do harm, that also allows us to justify returning evil for evil. See, I can make the other person feel the way they make me feel. And that's how the world operates. Jesus calls us to more. That's why he goes on, verse 32. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. He's saying, look, everyone in the world already operates that way. That, yeah, you love the people who love you. You are good to the people who are good to you. And if you can't love your enemies before you feel love for your enemies, then nothing will ever get better. And it's fair to ask this question: if that's the only way you can operate, that you only can love the people who love you, then what difference has God really made in your life? Because as we talked about, the rest of the world already believes that you should be good to the people who are good to you. So if you can't love your enemies, what difference has God really made in your life? If that's how you live, you're in the same place as all of those people who have never known God. Even sinners do that. Loving enemies requires us to do before we feel. Jesus goes on, verse 35. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. See, Jesus jumps right in and he leads us to the next reality that we need to understand when it comes to loving our enemies, and it's this, that loving your enemies requires you to eliminate expectations. That whatever expectation you have on this enemy that you're loving, you just drop it. And I know, you're saying, wait, you're telling me to love them, to do good to them, to bless them, to pray for them, and then to not expect them to change? That sounds crazy. Why would we do that? Like, if we just don't expect anything's going to get better, why would we do it? And I know. It sounds horrible. But it's actually a protection for you. See, because you already know, and this is actually your hesitation in loving your enemy, you know that they might not change. That's why loving your enemy is hard, because you offer this good and you know the potential is there, that it makes no difference with them. But I want to reframe that for you a bit, that this is actually a protection for you, because if you expect change and you don't see it, you'll be angry. And you'll be angry with them, and you'll be angry with God. God, why did you tell me to do this? You knew it wasn't going to work. This is your fault, God. See, if this is going to work, if loving your enemies is going to work, if things are really going to improve, here's the deal, it can't be transactional. It can't be you owe me this, or I did this, so now I deserve this from you. It can't be that. If our obedience to God is contingent on the reward or the result that we're going to see from another person, well, we could have done that without God. See, the good that we seek for ourselves is not what comes from the relationship with the other person, although we certainly want that. We want that to improve. We should want that to improve. But the good that we seek is different than just that relationship. It goes on in verse 35. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then, so once you can do that, then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. Jesus is saying, look, your relationship with God is more valuable than your relationship with them. Sure, yes, we want both if we can have it. We want a good relationship with everyone involved, God and them. But when we make loving our enemies contingent on that other person's response, we risk abandoning both relationships with them and with God. See, it's when we love our enemies that we actually end up engaging with God. The reward is our relationship with Him, not with them. Jesus goes on, finishing out verse 35. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And if you read over that very quickly, you think quickly to yourself, yeah, they are ungrateful and wicked. But you've missed who Jesus is talking to. See, Jesus talks about how God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked, and when He does, He's not talking about that person who has wronged you. He's talking about us. That our reward is great, and we are children of God because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. We are the ungrateful and the wicked. And that leads us to the third reality about loving our enemies that we have to understand, and it's this, that loving your enemies requires you to admit that you were God's enemy. You may not be able to love your enemy the way Jesus calls you to unless you first understand who you were to God. Jesus finishes out this section of His sermon by saying in verse 36, "Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." See, all people God has been kind to are wicked and ungrateful people, or at least they were, including you and I. Romans 5:10, the Apostle Paul writes this. He says, "For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" If you're a follower of Jesus, you are an adopted child who was once an enemy of God. A lot of you here today maybe don't feel like you were ever an enemy of God. The average person is probably going to say, I am not an enemy of God. I have no ill will towards God. I'm not angry with him. Never have been. But hear me when I say this. If you don't think you've ever been an enemy of God, then you are not a Christian today. A Christian is somebody who has discovered that it isn't that at one time, I just wasn't living morally or I wasn't living good, but it's that at one time I really resented God's control over my life. And even maybe in times in life when I was religious, that there were times where I was just using God all along. See, a true follower of Jesus acknowledges that, yes, I was religious and moral and trying to be good, but when God didn't give me the things that I wanted, I was furious. I've been living a good life. I go to church, I serve, I give, and now I'm here and I'm still not married. Or I still don't have kids. Or my career is not where I think that it should be. Or I've got certain relationships that are in the tank that it shouldn't be. That there are other people in life who have done a lot less good than me, and yet they've gotten a lot more of the things that I think that I deserve or the things that I want to have. See, followers of Jesus recognize that when we lived that way, we were using God, that we were trying to control God, that we didn't really love him. We were only playing ball with him as long as he would do what we wanted. Followers of Jesus realize that I have actually been God's enemy in all of that. See, once you realize that you were God's enemy, and he loved you anyways, and he did good towards you, that you are an adopted enemy, then you can begin to love your enemies. See, when you deal with people in life who use you and abuse you, how in the world can you begin to love them unless you have an example to follow? We need a frame of reference when people use us and abuse us to be able to say, yeah, but I used God, and I wouldn't want him to remember how I mistreated him. And when we can do that, it frees us to love our enemies. That's the power by which you can love your enemy. This is how you can do good to them and bless them and pray for them. Because here's the truth. If I could pack the whole sermon into a sentence, it's this right here. When you do good for them instead of to them, you avoid becoming like them and instead become more like him. We talk about it all the time here at Gateway. That we are called to love and to lead and to live like Jesus, who, when you were still his enemy, he sought your good, and he gave his life in place for your sins. He took the punishment that you deserved. I want to finish with a story that I heard, from a deceased pastor named Tim Keller. He tells a story about this man who owned a really large business, but he died and left behind his son, who was very young at the time. His business partner kind of took the son under his wing and raised him and provided for him, paid for him to go to school, and then after he graduated, gave him a job in the company that they had owned together, that he had owned with the boy's son, or with the boy's father. Eventually gives him this job, and it's a job with a lot of responsibility. Over time, the son abuses his position in the company. He misuses his department funds to fund his drug addiction, and eventually gets so in over his head, and he realizes he's about to be found out, that the auditors are coming and they're gonna see the books and they're gonna know everything. And so one night he's sitting in his desk and he's got all the financial records pulled up on the computer, and he knows the jig is up. He knows he's about to get caught, and so he decided to take his own life. But he didn't have the courage to do it, so he got drunk and figured that would give him the courage to do it, but he went a little too far with that, and he ends up passing out. And so there he is, passed out at his desk with everything pulled up on the screen and with all the financial records. And his benefactor comes in, the man who had essentially raised him after his father passed away, the one who had paid for him to go to school, the one who had given him the job. He comes in, he looks around, sees everything, realized what was going on. And he just wrote 2 notes real quickly. One was an email that he sent to the auditors. And he wrote this note to the auditors saying, look, I will repay everything that has been stolen. I'll repay it out of my own funds. And then he scribbled on a notepad. He left a note for the boy, for the man now, left a note for him saying, if you're ready to get help, I'm ready to forgive. The son woke up and he saw the note. He realized that his benefactor had come in, had seen him at his worst, and yet had offered restoration. And that's exactly what Jesus has done for you and for me. Is that he's looked into each of our hearts and he knows the grime, he knows the sin, and he looks at all of it and says, look, hey, if you're ready, I'm ready to forgive. And one of the ways that shows up in our life, as God's love and forgiveness and grace works in our lives, it plays out in our ability to offer that same love and grace and forgiveness to others. Not in a way that allows us to get trampled on, and not in a way that, continually puts us in the same situations over and over and over in order to be hurt, but in a way that seeks to preserve relationship, that believes the best about the other person to offer an opportunity for change. In a way that communicates, I understand what Jesus Christ has done for me, that I was once God's enemy, and he loved me and gave his life for me. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for Jesus. We thank you for your love and your grace for us that was poured out on the cross. God, when you gave your life for us before we knew you, before we loved you, before we made any effort, that God, you gave everything for us so that we could have a relationship with you. Father, would you help us live with that same kind of love and grace, with the understanding that we know it's going to take some difficult action on our part. We're going to have to do some things before we feel them. And we're going to need to drop our expectations of other people, of how we want them or expect them to respond. But we need to come on our knees before you, understanding that we were your enemy and you loved us. Father, thank you for Jesus. Amen.